Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. This is podcast number 103. Today we tackle one of the trickiest topics in historical study, time. You may think that time is one of those simple, everyday topics. After all, time just happens whether we pay attention to it or not. And isn't history just events that flow from the past to the present and then on into the future? Alas, no. While both of these statements are true, there's so much more to time that it's almost staggering when you try to dig into it. In fact, we're not going to try to cover it exhaustively today. We'll just make a good beginning and come back to the subject in future podcasts. As I said in our last podcast, time is the organizer of history. Since humans are creatures of time, we think of everything in reference to the line that stretches from the past and extends into the future. We maintain control of history by arranging events along this line. Timelines reveal relationships between events and help us infer causes and effects. We can augment this useful outcome by creating parallel timelines of different topics. Let's examine a 19th century literary example to see how this works. In 1854, Charles Dickens published a novel quite unlike those for which he had become famous. It was called Hard Times. He filled its pages with the major issues of the mid-19th century: industrialization, education, morality, philosophy, politics, and economics. While it's possible to enjoy Hard Times without an awareness of time, it makes far more sense if we create a series of timelines that document the major events surrounding its publication. A technological timeline is a good place to start. Hard Times is set in the fictitious industrial city of Coketown, a miserable place full of smoke-belching factories and mills. Dickens describes it as a town of red brick, or a brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever, and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it, and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye, and vast piles of building, full of windows where there was a rattling and a trembling all day long, and where the piston of the steam engine worked monotonously up and down like the head of an elephant in a state of melancholy madness. Dickens' soot-stained town makes a lot more sense if we see it in the context of the First Industrial Revolution, a movement that was reshaping Europe and the United States in rather drastic ways. A timeline is extremely helpful. We begin by marking the beginning and end of the Industrial Revolution, 1760 and 1840. A word of caution: when we work with ranges of dates, we must always remember that they're often approximations. People didn't wake up on January 1st, 1760 and say, "Wow, the Industrial Revolution has started. We're in for exciting times." Nor did industrial innovation come to a screeching halt on December 31st, 1840. Those dates are just convenient points that historians use to delineate the time period in which the most significant events occurred. Also remember that our modern names for historical periods were usually created in retrospect. Historians didn't identify the period between 1760 and 1840 as the First Industrial Revolution until later in the 19th century. While people certainly knew that they were living in a time of rapid change and industrialization, they didn't leap out of bed in the morning and say, "Thank heaven I'm living in the Industrial Revolution. It's so great to be working 12 hours a day in a factory instead of walking behind a plow." Coming back to timelines, however, we flesh out our technological timeline by marking the dates of major inventions and innovations. The steam engine, powered textile machinery, mass-produced iron and steel, the introduction of the factory system, and standardized working hours. Understanding this sequence of change makes the world of Coketown much more intelligible. Next, we move on to a political timeline by marking down the significant political events surrounding Dickens' novel. The Reform Bill of 1832 is a significant one as it extended the right to vote to more of the middle class. It also created conditions highly favorable to industrial cities, such as the fictitious Coketown. Trade unions and labor strikes figure prominently in hard times, so it's helpful to know that until 1824, unions were illegal in Britain. When the law forbidding unions was repealed, workers immediately began to strike. This led to a new law in 1825 that permitted unions but severely restricted their activities. Knowing these time-related facts helps clarify the atmosphere of murkiness surrounding the labor union's activities in hard times. We now move on to construct a timeline documenting the philosophical and social theories surrounding Dickens' novel. Education figures prominently in the early chapters, at the center of which is an unpleasant teacher named Mr. McChoakumchild, who actively suppresses imagination and emphasizes a purely factual and statistical view of the world. Dickens clearly reviled this system, which grew from a radical version of a philosophy called utilitarianism. Philosopher Jeremy Bentham had articulated utilitarian principles in a book published in 1789. Dickens also took issue with laissez-faire capitalism, a hands-off philosophy of economics. It had been popularized by Adam Smith's book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Dickens saw philosophies like these as leading to a greedy capitalism that exploits the working class and produces an unimaginative and cold middle class. As you can see, our parallel timelines have been very useful in helping us to construct a historical context surrounding the literary work. The more we understand the historical context, the better we understand the work. And that brings us back to the subject of church history. Throughout this podcast, I'll be constructing timelines and emphasizing how they contextualize the events of church history. Rather than treating the milestones of church history as isolated events, I'll be placing them within historical contexts to make them understandable. One of the weaknesses of our present time is that we often assess historical events outside of their own contexts. This is one reason that we've seen so much controversy in our educational system about how to teach history. It's also one reason that we've seen less objectivity in historical study and more emotional reaction to past events that we find disturbing. Now, I'm not for a minute saying that historical events don't have moral and ethical dimensions. They most certainly do, just as our own actions have moral and ethical sides. But while it's legitimate to identify and acknowledge the failings and blindnesses of past generations, it's unreasonable to expect those generations to hold to our present-day standards on the subject. Enough of that topic. We'll deal with it in other places where it's appropriate. As I warned you at the beginning of the podcast, time is a complex topic. We've explored the value of timelines and the historical context that they help us develop. But there are many other matters worth examining. For example, dates and historical periods are a major feature of timelines. But where do these come from? How do we know, for example, that the Apostle Paul died in AD 67? Why do some historians define the Renaissance as the time period between the 14th and 17th centuries, while others pick different endpoints? What about calendars and ancient timekeeping systems? These are huge cans of worms that fill entire textbooks, but they certainly can't be ignored. Rather than dealing with these topics all at once and scaring you away from this podcast, I'm going to deal with them in the places where they naturally come up, so you'll be hearing plenty more about time as we go along. But for now, our time is up. In our next podcast, I'm going to come clean and talk about my own philosophical perspectives on history and theology. While that sounds pretty boring, They're subjects that we need to canvass in the interests of honesty. In fact, I've already touched on this topic a bit when I referred to historical objectivity and expressed a few opinions on that subject. I hope you won't let it put you off from coming back. Believe me, it's worthwhile to know where a teacher stands on these topics. And to incentivize your return, once that topic is out of the way, we're going to get into some actual church history. So until next time, I'm Don Congdon, and this is Present Perfect. Have a great day. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation.